with Ayaan Hirsi. We are in the middle of something that's described as a culture war. Your experience and background of being a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, how much of this do you think is actually being orchestrated by nefarious players?
The greatest threat to Western civilization is coming from within Western civilization. It makes it very easy for outside forces, great powers, long-time adversaries of the West, to exploit this internal decay. There's just going to be a diverse number of people who will stand up for Western values, not because they're Western values, but because they're the best values.
The first thing I wanted to ask you about is, we are in the middle of something that's described as a culture war, and there are two sides that are broadly defined as the left, and on the other hand we have conservatism, and there's a lot of words that are thrown around, including by our broadly defined side, including the West. And that's usually what people refer to as to what they're fighting for, sort of the West. And I wanted you to explain what you are fighting for. If you had to sort of broadly define the struggle that you have, the fight that you have, the battles that you've chosen, and what it is you're actually fighting for and what you're trying to preserve in the West.
I would use words like civilization. I would use the autonomy of the human individual, life, liberty, the freedom to pursue one's direction and purpose, freedom of religion and conscience, freedom of speech, all of these freedoms that were enshrined in law and in constitutions across the West. And outside of Western civilization, these things are desirable, but they haven't quite been established. They haven't quite found, they haven't been grounded. I came from a tribal society, so I would say the first natural organizing principle is tribe, the tribalism, it's the bloodline. And all sorts of different human civilizations evolved away from the tribe to something else. And what Western society has achieved, the innovation of the nation, the idea of the nation and the nation state, having all sorts of strangers forming a society where they can rely on one another and trust one another and establish institutions that make it possible for the largest number of people within that nation to thrive. The West represents all of these things for me. Those of us who love Western civilization, and in any case, those of us who benefit from it, took all these things for granted. We just took it for granted that it's strong, it's hegemonic, it's self-perpetuating. People are coming from elsewhere. They want to come here, and therefore the assumption is they want to adapt and they want to assimilate. And I think in many ways that was a big mistake.
Where do you think the greatest dangers and threats to the order that you have described are coming from?
So the greatest, paradoxically, is internal. The greatest threat to Western civilization is coming from within Western civilization. Number one is the amnesia, is forgetting the roots of Western civilization. Number two, there is this inbuilt hostility, the romantic impulse. And the romantic impulse is not necessarily Western or Western oriented. It's universal. All human beings suffer this from this idea that somewhere in the past things were better somehow. And so this pull towards primitivism is always there. But in the West, it's very, very strong at the moment. So the amnesia combined with the primitivism, combined with very bad ideas that are prevalent today, the resurgence of communism. Communists failed when they tried to make an economic argument. And so now they've come around and they started, through the culture wars, this idea of identity politics. So it is grievance-based, it is redistribution of wealth, but it's let's take it from rich countries and give it to poor countries. So stupid ideas like that taught in schools, in universities, that then prevail. And so I think the biggest threat is coming from the inside, but it makes it very easy for outside forces, great powers, long-time adversaries of the West to exploit this internal decay, to exploit the amnesia, to exploit the self-loathing, to exploit the proliferation of bad ideas. But the West is still strong, very strong. All we have to do is identify our strengths and the pragmatism that we have, which I see in America a lot, and stand up to these bad forces on the inside and the outside.
I agree with your thesis about amnesia, but I would also add, I think that there is one of the great issues of the West is its absolute victory. The fact that ultimately we have achieved the absolute pinnacle of civilization and of comfort, of eliminating disease, of having peace since World War II, broadly speaking, of having incredible economic comforts, incredible technological advancement. And in essence, this has led over 3-4 generations to a generation of young people with no sense of purpose. So there is Fukuyama described it quite interestingly in his End of History, where he said that sort of a people devoid of any struggle will end up making one up. And this seems to be also one of the main things, especially in my generation and Generation Z, that we're seeing. We're seeing this around the Gaza solidarity encampments, around universities where you have young college students who have very little understanding of the Middle East and hadn't been interested in it at all before October 7th, suddenly running around with keffiyehs and shouting silly slogans. We saw it with Black Lives Matter and a variety of other protest movements. How much do you think of this is organic and genuine, and how much of this do you think, especially with your experience and background of being a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, how much of this do you think is actually being orchestrated by nefarious players who want to see the collapse of the West?
There's most certainly nefarious plots and subversion is what I would call it. But that's because, again, I want to go back for us making it too easy for them. The plots to subvert the West, to subvert America, were always there. But as long as Westerners were self-conscious, as long as they were dedicated to the maintenance of the institutions that make open societies open, so the institutions of culture, the institutions of faith, and there was this connection between, and a strong connection between the knowledge of the past. Every child was required to study the classics. When you study the classics, you understand why things are the way they are today. You also understand that way back in time, civilizations rose and peaked and declined and fell. And so we stopped then this maintenance. And that makes it very easy for all these, the Islamic Republic of Iran and other Islamists, the Sunni Islamists who think the West is decadent, Western norms are ungodly and they're bad and they need to be destroyed and replaced with something else. The Chinese Communist Party, Russia's Putin, but also the idea of communism that was born in the West and we thought in 1989 was completely defeated. And what does it mean to think that it was defeated? Is to take it for granted. We won the argument, so there is no need to keep harping on why communism was bad. There's no need to teach young minds how to think critically about bad ideas. I think we dropped the ball. And by dropping the ball, we have, in my view, we've let down young generations. Again, I forget whose quote this is, but there are two types of barbarians that you have to initiate into society. One group of barbarians are newborn babies, and you've got to transmit knowledge, initiate them into how society works. The others are immigrants or outsiders or aliens or whatever you want to call them. And the West used to be really good at doing that because there was this self-confidence that, all right, you're here to become a part of this, then here are the requirements. And our standards are high, our standards of merit, our standards of humanity, our standards of how we behave, and so on and so forth. And of course, that assimilation process is difficult. No one ever said it is not difficult, but it had to happen to sustain the existing civilization. And we dropped the ball for both of those groups. So it looks to me as if it is, no one seems to be really caring for how to bring the newborn babies, the new generations, so Gen Z, when you look at Gen Z and what they know about the West, that they are going to inherit. And the immigrants that have been coming in, since the 1960s and 70s, what they know is superficial. And not only that, it's negative. The prevalent idea in Western society today is that there is the white man who is an oppressor, who is an exploiter, who is loathsome, and whose legacy is loathsome. And that needs to be destroyed. The structures need to be taken down. That's the mind virus of wokeism. And then along come the Islamists saying pretty much the same thing, but they want to replace it with Sharia law. And of course, the others exploit it. And so if you're a young person and you go to school and you're taught the history of Western society, and all you learn is colonialism, slavery, exploitation, and you don't learn, there's nothing for you to be proud of. You feel guilty. You started by saying we've reached the pinnacle of humanity, the pinnacle of history, but we still have ways to go ahead because the rest of the world hasn't caught up. And so if you're a young person, all you want to do is hide in shame, especially if you're a white young man. And white young men's minds are messed up.
Bouncing back on what you said about lack of self-confidence in the West, there was I forget the name of the architect, but an architect was asked why the West no longer builds cathedrals. And he had a rather wonderful answer, saying simply that it takes more than opinions to build a cathedral, it takes conviction. And there's definitely a sense that there is very little conviction in the West, and in the sort of direction that we're going, we are very directionless. You had this theory about these two archetypes in society, one of Mr. Consensus and the other of Mr. Courage. And I wanted to ask you more about that, and if you could explain broadly your hypothesis around this Mr. Consensus and how Mr. Consensus took over the Western institutions. That would be very interesting, and sort of also to explain why you think that there is so little of Mr. Courage in that story, in that narrative.
So Mr. Consensus versus Mr. Courage, I think if we want to appreciate who Mr. Courage is, we have to go back to recent history, as recent as the Second World War. And during that history, and I hope that young people are still taught something about it, there was a very clear confrontation between good and evil. Hitler was evil, and everything he stood for was evil. And initially, in the 1930s, when he had written that book, Mein Kampf, and he had made it very clear that if he came to power, he promised to do certain things. For instance, eliminate Jewish people, homosexuals, and others. All of that was ignored to a certain extent by the people in power. There were moments when you reflect on that history when Hitler could have been stopped. He wasn't stopped. And things started to heat up. And it was very clear that Europe had to go to war with him to stop this man. There were voices like that of Chamberlain, who still believed that maybe somehow they could appease him, that somehow they could reach some kind of compromise with him. And there were minds that understood that that wasn't going to happen. He was just a different kind of beast. And in that history, individuals like Winston Churchill, and later on the American presidents that stood by Winston Churchill, understood that there was no appeasing of Hitler. There was no appeasing of the Japanese. If you read that history of Pearl Harbor, and when the decision is made whether to use the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I think these leaders were staring at evil in the face, and they understood that really it needed courage to pull off something like that, to destroy evil. And then fast forward, we went into the Cold War, and there was this balance between the winners of the Second World War, now divided, the Soviet Union, and the United States, America, and her allies. And in that back and forth, again, you see that moment with the Bay of Pigs moment, that the leaders in office were again confronted with the same, this could be the end of the world moment, and we have to be very, very, very brave to defeat the Soviet Union. And by the grace of God, they make the right decision. And then we go to 1989. The Soviet Union is on the back foot, they're broken up. The leadership that emerges after 1989 is a leadership that had not gone through real war. They had only known peace. They had only known prosperity. And I think for too long, they concluded that they could fix the world through soft power, through compromise, through collaboration, through consensus. And in hindsight, that was a mistake. And there were many times when they were faced with evil. 9/11, 2001 is one of them. Later on, we had ISIS. And I think over time, if you have done your classics properly in your history, you can see with the CCP, with the president of North Korea, with the Islamic Republic of Iran, with Hamas, there are forces in the world that you simply cannot have consensus with. And to deal with these forces, you do need Mr. Courage. And we haven't had Mr. Courage since the death of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan. I think that generation just went, and now we're stuck with a leadership who can't tell the difference between right and wrong, or if they can tell the difference, they still believe that we somehow are going to talk Vladimir Putin out of not just invading Ukraine, but expanding and going beyond that. Or we are going to talk to Hamas and convince them about a two-state solution. Or we are going to talk to the Islamist infrastructure and networks on Western soil who are poisoning people's minds. Young children, young immigrants, vulnerable groups. We're just going to talk this stuff out of their minds. We're going to, through diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're going to appease this radical Marxist forces in our universities by giving them what they want, and somehow they're going to be satisfied and they're going to leave us alone. And that's Mr. Consensus for me.
First threats that you brought up, or the first opponents that you brought up, are all foreign adversaries. And I think it's definitely easier to delineate between right and wrong when you're facing someone like Vladimir Putin, or you're facing the Ayatollah in Iran, or you're facing the CCP. But from the perspective of the inside threat, it's an interesting one, because Nazism in Germany was obviously a very obvious evil. Communism in the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc, again, was a very obvious one. The force that we're dealing with now is particularly pernicious and dangerous because it is wrapped around these positive ideas. And I think in many ways, when I look at these protests across universities currently around the Israel-Hamas war, I actually believe that most of the young people that are attending them, they're not anti-Semites deep down. These are people who've genuinely been misled, but actually believe that they're fighting for a good cause. And I think that's the same for the people who are pushing these ideas of these virtues, so-called virtues of diversity or tolerance, which makes that threat so exceptionally dangerous because it is wrapped in these ideas of goodness. And the proponents of this idea, I think most of them, I don't necessarily think they're evil. I just think they're very misguided and misled and perhaps confused, and aren't aware that the values and their ideas that they're pushing and the societal changes that they're implementing step by step, block by block, are actually dismantling the very society that gave them all the freedoms to do all of this. So how would you suggest, what is the best way, in your opinion, to stand up to this threat? Because it's not an obvious one. It's not a question of defeating the German Nazi army. It's not a question of making the Berlin Wall fall. In this case, we're dealing with an idea. It's been described by Professor Gad Saad as a mind virus. It's been described in many various ways. And In some of our prior conversations, you mentioned a very interesting tactic that I'd like you to sort of tell us more about, of using the very strategy of the Muslim Brotherhood and some of the things that they have been doing to counter that threat.
I said earlier that we let down, there were two groups, two barbarians.
Sure.
The newborn babies and immigrants. So we let down the young generation because the young generation are miseducated. For me, when I went to the University of Leiden, I encountered the concept of critical thinking, which is you're presented with these theories that all sound fantastic. And they had us actually read Karl Marx's, the original literatures. But when you read about communism and you read Marx, and I was in my 20s, I remember thinking the injustice this man describes is so infuriating that these haves deserve absolutely everything that comes to them. So we weren't just left with the little red book of Mao, we weren't just left with the Communist Manifest. The workshop in class was to exercise our critical faculties. It was to teach us how to see, well, okay, let's acknowledge that there's injustice all across the board. How do you go from the empirical acknowledgement of that injustice to testing all the different theories of how to improve things? You don't really fix poverty. It is, you ultimately, you're trying to figure out what are the best ways for human beings to flourish, balance freedom with how much government to fix things, and all of these things. Mm-hmm. But the point I want to make is, the point of that university education was critical thinking. And you were asked to leave your emotions and your religious convictions at the door. You're an 18-year-old, you come in and you're taught over a period of 4 years how to think critically about these things and not swallow every little propaganda that's put through your mouth. And what I'm observing now is that we somehow moved away from that, and young people go to university and they absorb there is an injustice. Black people in America have been subjected first to slavery and then to segregation, and now they're out in the streets shouting, defund the police, because a handful of young black men have been shot. And the context of those shootings, the context of what leads to the poverty of African Americans in 2024, you don't get any of that. You just have this emotional, something is terribly wrong, we must do something about it, and I'm young, I'm white, I'm privileged, I'm going to do something about it. That, in a nutshell, and I know I'm simplifying, is what's going on across the board. So if I accuse you of Islamophobia and you listen to my grievances, the expectation is that you indulge me. You look at the conflict between Israel and Hamas, and you see young Palestinian children starving. You see young Palestinian children in the midst of a war theater, and you're told, blame the entity that's throwing the bombs. They are evil, they are responsible for this. All attention deflected away from the actual ideological force with its militias that keeps this cycle of violence going, that's using Palestinian children as cannon fodder, using them as tools. Hamas fighters hide behind women and children. They place their weapons in classrooms, in hospitals, in neighborhoods. So the young mind at Harvard doesn't see this full picture and then gauge good versus evil, maybe the lesser evil of two evils. And that's what the West, I think, made the West distinct from other civilizations and other societies, was this investment in developing and molding the critical mind. A lot of this was dispassionate and impartial, and our justice system is supposed to be impartial. property rights. The whole concept of what makes the West very, very different is through this critical thinking. And that critical thinking is attached to reality and realism, and that in the end has a conception of religion, Christianity in Western society, which is God is reality. And so that pursuit of reality is, I think, what we've drifted away from. And this is a very long way of saying the wound or the virus or the cancer is something that's it's growing here in the West. I'm not going to give you an excuse to blame outside forces, but it has made it easy for outside forces to exploit that wound.
How much of the current radicalism from the left that we're seeing and what is described broadly as wokeism do you think has its roots in the secularization and atheization of Western societies?
All of it, or most of it. And the reason why I say that, again, I've changed my mind drastically about this. I interpreted the Enlightenment as a moving away from superstition. I grew up in an environment where superstition was prevalent, and not just religious superstition, but tribal superstition. I mean, it's like a primitive atheism. Coming to the West, I really appreciated and was dazzled to a certain degree by this idea that reason and the scope of reason is capable of capturing every corner of every problem, because again, we engage in this critical thinking. What I hadn't realized was that enlightenment that I so admired was actually the child of years and years, centuries of religious, that is, Christian infighting, Christian discussions, Christian debates, Christian schisms, and of course, Christian bloodshed. Out of that came this leave unto God what's God's, unto Caesar what's Caesar's, but also a separate realm for issues of reason versus issues of faith. And all of these separations then led to all of these things that we love and admire about the West. But if you cut that off, if you cut the whole past off, and you just start with the element of reason, and you then assume that everyone is endowed with reason, and it is just the natural, reason is the natural way of things, I think that is when we, as atheists, well, I'm not an atheist anymore, but when the blind spot of atheism is revealed. I quoted when I wrote that piece for Unheard, Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell was speaking to an audience probably of mostly Christians or people who were on the fence about their faith. And he makes it very clear in the essay, his expectation, if we just shed Christianity, we are going to live in this wonderful ocean of reason, and we will say, you know, all fear, all superstition, all of that will go away. And I think G.K. Chesterton and others observe and say, no, men will believe in anything. And we've now entered this era of great wealth, great affluence, great technological advances. And we have people in their 20s and in their 30s and in their 40s who are no longer Christian because they haven't been taught any Christianity, and they have drifted away from their traditional religions, and they believe in anything. They believe that there are multiple genders. They believe ideas about and worries and concerns about the climate to such extremes. They no longer believe in the nation state. They believe, Ibrahim X. Kendi, almost illiterate, comes up with stupid ideas like,
Isn't he a Harvard-educated
yes,
public intellectual?
Harvard or the University of Boston or wherever he went through. But he comes around and says, I'm going to explain to you racism, and we have to fight racism with anti-racism. And he presents these young minds with a theology of racism, and they swallow it. And Robin DiAngelo, I don't know where she materialized out of, but she comes and says, all white people are racist, projecting her problem on everyone else. And then demanding and saying, you are white, you're racist, and if you object to my accusation of you, which is a vile accusation, you're fragile. This is circular reasoning. You would think that intelligent people, well-educated, wealthy people, would look at her and give her a ticket to the closest psychiatrist and say, you ought to go and see a doctor yourself. But no, all these corporations and all of these institutions have introduced unconscious bias training. And so you have these well-meaning, well-intentioned, good people who are allowing themselves to be conned by these con people. This is the reality we live in, and allow themselves to be humiliated and allow themselves to be herded into taking part in what really is a modern witch hunt type of thing. Let's pile up on this person or on that person and cancel this person and shame that person. And so that is superstition all around. When we were in Africa, I saw a lot of superstition. I saw a lot of stupidity and a lot of darkness. And I thought, that's because people are not educated. When you go to school and you're educated, you think, and you think critically, and you don't fall for these things. And now people with university degrees from Harvard, Columbia, Penn University, Oxford, Cambridge, they are engaging in these modern forms of sanitized superstition.
Nassim Taleb has an amusing way of referring to people like that. He calls them intellectuals yet idiots, which I think is a rather wonderful way of framing it. We're reaching a stage of this civilizational battle or a period of decline where it's almost impossible to ignore some of the effects of that ideology over the last 30, 40, 50 years, depending on how you count it. Do you think that as we see certain elements of this ideology and the real-life ramifications of what academics had sort of theorized would happen versus the reality of what is actually happening, do you think that we will see an increased amount of people speaking out and deciding to be courageous? Are we reaching a moment where the price of bearing the reality of these policies is greater than the risk of speaking out? Are we there yet, or do you think that it'll take a while still before that happens?
So I'll tell you, it's a different way of saying, are you optimistic?
Yes.
And I'll tell you what makes me optimistic. When you look at the surveys, so for instance, the latest drama about these universities, every survey yields that the people who are behaving in these odious ways are a minority, whether they actually believe in it or whether they are miseducated young people following along. And you have to feel sorry for the young people. Sometimes they're asked what river to what sea, they don't know. And there was the young woman who was asked, why are you here? I think it was in NYU. And she said, I don't know. Why are you here? So there's a great deal of naivety and innocence and herd mentality. That too makes me optimistic, because when young people find out that they've been lied to, it can generate a sense of indignance and standing up and fighting back and fighting those who lied to them. But the majority of the students, a majority of the population, they really do not like the woke mind virus. They do not like radical Islamism. They do not like the message of the CCP. They don't like communism. Everybody knows what communism is and where it led to, and for me, there's no romance there. And so the question then is, will we stand up to this? And you see things scaling. You see moms worried about their children. But you also see immigrants, people who came like me from countries that had completely failed and thought we were going to find, opportunity and a happy life here, and looking everywhere and seeing, heavens help, the problems have followed us and they're here now. And there's this sense of responsibility. So in America, the Hispanic community, for instance, is incredibly anti-woke. The Indian community is incredibly anti-woke. Sure. And why? I mean, if you're coming from Venezuela and Cuba, and you have people in Massachusetts telling you all about the merits of communism, you do a double take and say no. You are mistaken, I'm not. And so I think there's just going to be this combination of a diverse number of people, racially diverse, age diversity, religious diversity, who will stand up for Western values, not because they're Western values, but because they're the best values. They're the values that everybody sought to come and came looking for. So in that sense, I'm optimistic. I'm also optimistic that Western society has this thing called reflection and critical thinking. So if you look at the past on civilizations that had fallen, there wasn't much else to look back into. They didn't know about what made civilizations rise and thrive and then fall. There's a great deal of scholarship in the West on these things. I think we all sense that this is a turning point, and if we don't turn now, we'll lose everything. I think there is that sense. The institutions have been weakened, but they haven't completely fallen. And so some of them can be rescued. Some of them have stage 4 cancer and they're going to die, and we'll just have to come up with perhaps a number of new universities, a number of new schools, things like that. But the idea of the rule of law, the idea that you are innocent until proven guilty, the idea of, which is the basis for all of it, teachings of Jesus Christ. I'm just really going to say it's the way, because I find a lot of people who are inhibited and who think that they'll come across as superstitious if they talk about Christianity. But those teachings, unto Jesus, what's Jesus is love thy neighbor, that stuff, that's enduring. And the superiority of these ideas is now glaring. So I think I'm optimistic that.
But it's only glaring to those who are aware of what the rest of the world looks like.
Yes.
You know, there's this wonderful saying that goes, "What do they know of Europe who only Europe know?"
Yeah.
You know, if you are only raised in the West and you've only traveled around the West and you haven't spent a substantial amount of time in Africa or in the Middle East,
yeah,
you're completely unaware of the incredible blessing and fortitude that you've received by being merely born in the West. And this is a great fear of mine, is that actually the majority of the West is completely unaware of what the rest of the world actually looks like.
So that's why it's your job and my job and all of us, all of the rest of us who know what life is like in Africa, in Latin America, in parts of Asia, in China, even though China's now got all this glitter, but I mean, you're surveilled constantly by the government, so you don't have freedom. I think that's why it's our job to be courageous, to cast aside Mr. Consensus, and cast aside this, we're putting these in these silos or in these, pigeonholed into, you are a white man, so this is what you can say. You're a black woman, so only you can say this, and you are Jewish, and you can just break free from all that garbage and just say, no, I'm a human being, I'm a citizen, I love my fellow human beings, and I'll tell you what things are like in Africa. And so the other day when I saw that description in the Crimson at Harvard University, where they seem to be celebrating tribalism, it's my ambition to tell all who will listen what it is like to live in a tribal society where life is short and nasty and brutal. And I think anybody who knows what life is like under communist rule, we have to bring back and teach people about Stalin and Mao and Cuba under Castro. Well, Castro the son now. And what thinks there's nothing to romanticize there. It's starvation, it's oppression, it's masses and masses of dead people. It's nothing, it's nihilism. We've got to show young people that that is what they're romanticizing. Radical Islam, it's bloodshed. It's the enslavement of women. It's the beheading of people. I mean, that's quite recent. It's just, it's October 7 and it's ISIS and it's Al-Qaeda. And how on earth can you forget? This is what I mean by amnesia. And it's really standing up to Mr. Consensus and saying, you can't have a compromise with evil. The last Davos gathering, and the one in January, the theme was trust. How do we regain trust? Why are people losing trust in us? And I think it's time also to tell Mr. Davos the truth and say, you lose trust when you become so arrogant as to collectively, as sitting leaders, call citizens deplorables, call them racists, call them small-minded, flood them with immigrants, with changes that they haven't asked for. And you profit, Mr. Consensus or Lady Consensus, but you leave the rest of the country this way. Why? I mean, they should have been angry a long time ago. We've got to stand up for all of us, and especially your age group, people in their 30s and in their 20s. It's going to be their world. So I think it's just shed all these inhibitions and stand up for what you know is right.
You've recently launched Restoration Bulletin. Tell us about that.
I launched Restoration Bulletin because I think our ambition is to restore the foundational institutions and the cultural institutions of what has made the West great. I recommend that everyone listen to that Culture by Yuri Bezmenov. I think it's 1983. Yuri Bezmenov was a KGB agent who he defected.
Yeah.
He describes to his class of, I think, Canadian or American students what subversion was according in the Soviet Union, and that subversion wasn't James Bond type thrilling things, but it's really a very boring, gradual undermining of institutions, of the society that you designate as a target or as your enemy. And a lot of that subversion has happened. I identify it. I mean, I think, why is it that suddenly we have a contagion of everyone changing their agendas? That's not a gradual evolution of, oh, our society just decided to be this. So there must be something underneath that. When you scratch the surface, you see, yes, there are organized activist groups that are promoting this idea. And so you ask the question, why is that? Why is our education system providing us with these nonsensical degrees? There is an agenda to undermine religious institutions and educational institutions. So the answer is to restore these institutions to their original and intended purpose. And Bezmenov says this when you get to the end of his lecture, and he says, what gives life meaning and purpose ultimately is this desire and this belief in a higher power. And the concept of a higher power in Western society, that original idea, I think that if people understand what it is, they know that they can always turn to a God of love and a God of compassion and a God that is forgiving and redeeming, rather than get lost in these idols that tell you to cancel people in pursuit of a utopian of justice that first requires you to have full unchecked power and punish people, and only then can the utopia be reached, or Sharia law, Islamic law, which I am assuming perhaps most of your audiences know by now.
It's interesting that you talk about restoration. It feels that actually the majority of the West, if you look at the two biggest political parties in the US, if you look at their slogans, interestingly, both the Republicans with Make America Great Again and the Democrats with Build Back Better, both reference the past as a better place, which is an interesting sort of sign of the times we're in, where there is a universal understanding that somehow we've gone wrong somewhere. I think that's an interesting kind of element of the upcoming elections. Ayaan, thank you so much for your time and for the conversation. Really appreciate it. It was incredibly interesting.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the work you do.
Thank you, my pleasure.